Conversations with the Mind podcast, where we explore consciousness through conversations with interesting people. Our mission is to engage the collective mind piece by piece to bring greater clarity of mind to our listeners locally and across the planet, and to contribute to broaden the shared experiential knowledge and wisdom of existence. Okay, folks, welcome back to Conversations with the Mind. I'm your host, as always, Shane Lemaster, and I'm here with very special guest, Dr. Michael Winkelman. How are you, sir?
Doing great. Thanks, Shane. It's nice to be here.
And did I say your name correctly?
Yeah.
Okay, perfectly. Okay, so the first question is the same for everybody, and that is that the title of the podcast is Conversations with the Mind. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, since you are an individual consciousness, and this is sort of my attempt to start cataloging connections between consciousness, what does that title mean to you, and how does it land? What sort of things come to your mind when you think of Conversations with the Mind?
Well, I guess I've been a little influenced by Buddhism in the sense of thinking as the mind is sort of this, partially tamed monkey that's always trying to be out of control with all the little inputs that it has. So, I mean, that would be one view of it, is sort of this semi-autonomous information processing complex that is pulled in lots of different directions by the underlying brain, by the experiences of the person, and ultimately by the demands of the situation. But we can also think of the mind as a little bit of a higher order kind of organizational principle that tries to bring together the diverse inputs from sensations and perceptions and memories and intentions and emotions, and modulate it in a way that allows the organism to be functional. So we'll go more in that direction. Mind is something that helps us be more functional in handling a lot of different kinds of information.
So functionality being maybe a key driver of a lot of evolutionary processes, including maybe the mind as well, and maybe consciousness. But do you see any other maybe outside the box purposes for the mind other than just functionality and perpetuating the species and things like that? Do you see other aspects such as like mysticism and spirituality and I don't know, awakening as something maybe beyond the physical or the biological needs of the organism?
Well, I mean, some of those things I would consider to be part of our, biological needs, a pursuit of meaning, a pursuit of answers to ultimate questions. But I'd also think that when we come to addressing questions about, for instance, spirituality, I mean, to me, mind is something that probably gets in the way more than, leads us to those things. I have this view of mind as sort of this chatterbox that's constantly giving us, directions and explanations and excuses, and that gets in the way of the direct experience of, the more fundamental aspects of consciousness and, the bases of spiritual experience and things like this. I would think that a lot of mystical traditions would see, the mind is something that has to be first, sort of disciplined and tamed and perhaps finally set aside in some ways to allow some deeper neurologically driven ways of knowing to emerge.
Yeah, so again, going beyond the physical and almost using the mind with this conceptualization as like a tool that you gain proficiency with, and then eventually you don't need the tool anymore. Taking it down a layer, what is it using? What is the thing that is using the tool? What is the, is mind? Do you separate mind from consciousness? And maybe is consciousness, in one of your papers, you had a great quote where you said, let me quote it real quick. Consciousness is the interaction, the relationship between the knower and the known, between mental and physical levels of reality. And when I read that, I thought of the Buddhist concepts too of that the true reality or consciousness, or what is behind the mind's action, is possibly this space between things, the space between the breath, the space between a phenomenon and the observer. This space between, I don't know, maybe is the thing that's holding all of this together.
Well, I wish I'd been able to write down your questions as you spewed them out there. I don't think I kept track of all of them. I guess the first thing I would say is, we're not going to get rid of the mind. There are many important things that the mind needs to do for us. But it's sort of like, engaging in a particular kind of program that, occupies our processing capacities and keeps us from paying attention to other kinds of information. And, sometimes we need to pay attention to information in the physical world, in the social world. And then other times we're sort of seeking, higher order, explanations or higher order integrations of our experience. And I think that that's where, at least at the first step, I think, as you were saying, the mind has to sort of step out of the way. Mm-hmm. One of the things that was coming to me while you were asking your questions was this notion that the brain has a lot of different kinds of innate modules. I mean, we have innate modules for processing a lot of different kinds of information unconsciously. And, this is sort of Gardner's notion about innate intelligences, where the brain processes things pretty much automatically. And I think that the mind is sort of like one of those functional systems that is always putting together a kind of a system of explanation about why we're doing what it is that we're doing now, rather than being in the now. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, I think the mind has to sort of be set aside in order to allow some of the more basic forms of gnosis to emerge. And some of these are forms of knowing that existed long before language. I mean, to me, the mind is sort of, the language generating system of explanation. And that's a very recent kind of capacity of human beings in our long evolutionary history. And to me, when we start to get to the roots of consciousness, and to spirituality in particular, we're trying to understand ways in which we knew the world prior to the emergence of these complex language-driven programs.
Okay, so it sounds like you do separate consciousness from mind, and I'm more interested in the consciousness piece. And you have a background in shamanism, shamanistic cultures, cross-cultural aspects of this as well, and I'm wondering how other cultures view consciousness as opposed to how we in the West see consciousness. And then is there maybe a universal underlying understanding or search for what you're talking about?
Tough questions there, Shane. I'll see what I can do. First, I'd go back to the consciousness versus mind. I see consciousness as being a much more encompassing construct than mind, which is a very specific form of consciousness. I think that consciousness in some ways needs to be understood as you sort of suggested in my quote, some manner of knowing. There's something that is known, and in that sense, all cultures have concepts about how we know the world, although we may not find a neat word that would translate as consciousness. As far as consciousness goes today, I think that one of the problems we have in understanding it is that people have such diverse conceptualizations of just what it is that constitutes a proper exemplar or proper definition of consciousness. Indeed, some of the philosophical traditions would deem anything less than elaborate verbal explanations of why you did what you did to be, the epitome of consciousness. Anything less than that, doesn't really constitute consciousness. I mean, deny consciousness to animals is a long-standing, philosophical posture. Mm-hmm. So to me, we need a really broad understanding of what it is that constitutes consciousness. And I think one that not only enables us to appropriately attribute certain forms of consciousness to lower life forms, but perhaps ultimately to attribute consciousness to non-organic systems. And in that sense, you might say, well, how can they be conscious? Well, it depends on how it is that you conceptualize consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you could even conceptualize it as just a system that, operates to maintain some kind of homeostasis or balance or something. And I spoke with Dennis McKenna on my podcast a couple weeks ago, and he was talking a lot about plant consciousness and the consciousness of the entire planet and, Gaia mindsets or approaches to consciousness. It seems like, here in the West, we discount so many other forms of consciousness that could be out there, with a human-centric view on, almost a monopoly on this thing, and I think that's to our detriment. I'm wondering if you have, how you incorporate, like you said, inorganic matter to consciousness beyond like post-humanist, beyond, our understanding of it from our perspective.
Well, I think that the, sort of a key influence in my developing understanding came from biologist Bruce Lipton, who had a notion about, the cell membrane as mediating the cell's relationship to the universe. And my take from his work was that, it's what the cell knows is right there at the membrane. It's the mediating structure between inner and outer realities. And to me, this became sort of like a general model for consciousness, in the sense that consciousness is that which mediates what it is that we know. Consciousness is how it is that we're able to take some form of information from the universe and transpose it to something that we can experience vis-a-vis our physiological apparatus and the cognitive structures that organize the information we receive. So in this sense, I sort of see consciousness as being this ability to respond to information. And in that sense, plants show all kinds of ways of responding to information. Their roots grow to where water is, their leaves on a daily basis orient to the sun, etc. So it's easy to see that plants have ways of responding to what's important about what the universe has out there. They're not just passive recipients. So to me, understanding consciousness means taking what I would call a neural epistemological approach, which is to say that on one hand, we're paying attention to what it is that our bodies can process. What kind of information can our bodies acquire? And recognizing that most of the information available in the universe is not accessible to our bodies or our own particular instantiation of sensory capacities. So we get a limited picture. And then we learn how to interpret that limited information. So to me, then the second part is about epistemology. If we want to understand consciousness, we have to understand how it is that human beings know the world. Epistemology is basically the study of how humans know. And this leads us to some very interesting understandings of consciousness, because one of the very first things it tells us is that we really don't know the universe. We never know the universe directly. That basically we develop models based upon prior experience, and ultimately it is memory and expectations that provide the basis for consciousness. Memory and expectation precede experience. And it's the models, some simulation permitted by our physiological and cognitive capacities, that produce consciousness, some form of experience. It's stimulated in some ways by the universe, but it's not the universe. So ultimately, consciousness is a model. And that's why two people can stand in the same place and have the same, physical universe in front of them and the same stimuli coming in, but they have very different consciousness of the situation. It's because their models, their prior experiences, their constructed views is what is going to inform them of what's there. And I think that this same kind of model can be extended all the way down the great chain of being to other animals. They have different forms of consciousness, because they have different forms of physiological capacities to process information, and they have built different kinds of models to interpret that information in terms of their own sense of entity.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm wondering if in your journey through your own explorations of what consciousness is, have you come across theories, and if you have, how have you felt about it? Theories of consciousness in which people talk about consciousness as being beyond the body, that it doesn't necessarily need this this receptacle in order to manifest, that it's maybe out here somewhere, that there's a collective stream of consciousness, that it's that it can't be measured or something like that. And if you have come across a theory such as that, which is kind of, I don't know if it plays in with your own did you say neuroepistemological view?
Neuroepistemological approaches. How does the study of brain function inform us about how it is that we know the world?
Right. And so some people argue that consciousness isn't even it's larger than our body, that it's maybe it's larger than the universe, or that consciousness or the universe can't maybe exist without the other. Things like this. Have you looked into anything or heard anything from others speaking in that way?
Well, I think that, the really learned people who have explored consciousness experientially would say that consciousness permeates the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, then you have to start to understand what their notions of consciousness are. But to me, it ultimately has to do with some form of knowing. Mm-hmm. Something has to know for consciousness. And, when the leaves shift their orientation to the sun as the sun moves, they're manifesting a form of consciousness. When roots grow to where water is, they're manifesting a form of consciousness. When an animal, moves away from a loud noise, they're manifesting a form of consciousness. And there are infinite forms of consciousness, mm-hmm. in a sense. Then the question becomes, which forms of consciousness can we tap into? Mm-hmm. Ordinarily, our forms of consciousness are very limited to our personal preoccupations. Some people might say driven by the circuitry of our default mode network. We're sort of mired in our own personal space, and we don't even hear people talk to us or things around us, because we have a very focused kind of awareness. But to me, the notion that consciousness is a form of information representation for something that responds to that information, then says, there's all kinds of things in the universe that have some ability to respond to information, and even things that we would not attribute central nervous systems to appear to have that capacity. So I think that this notion of information, knowledge of some form of representation of information, to me gives us this generic model to say, yes, consciousness is throughout the universe. It exists in an infinitude of forms, and humans have limited capacities to tap into that. When we do tap into various forms of information, we often get a lot of different kinds of information that's not related to our personal history, our personal, physiological being. It's things that have no direct connection with us as a history of being with a history. So this suggests that consciousness can be acquired from other entities, other forms. We can, in essence, experience the consciousness of others, of other places, of other people, of other animals. And when you bring out the shamanic perspective, this was one of the things that shamans did. They worked on developing access to the consciousness of animals. Mm-hmm. And this was a fundamental power that the shamans acquired, to be able to use the physical and experiential capacities of animals to expand their consciousness of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I was making it too complicated for myself, unfortunately, because it is. It seems like it's a really complicated topic, but we all experience consciousness, and it can be, I think, it has the potential to be a unifying aspect that we can all tap into to, overcome things like war and hatred towards each other and things like that. This idea that we all experience this one thing, no matter your age, race, gender, whatever. And I also love how you bring in the idea that consciousness is infinite and that humans can only tune into or tap into certain capabilities within this infinite span of possibility, which gives me, because I come from a sport and performance psychology background, I'm really keyed into, how can we optimize human mental function, human physical function, human spiritual function, holistic functioning, and really this optimization by tapping into things that maybe are hidden to us or forgotten, abilities that we used to have with consciousness that maybe we've lost through time, and through the loss of stories around it. I know some traditions still practice a lot of different techniques to tap into different abilities within this big spectrum of consciousness. And unfortunately, I see a lot of people still so narrow-mindedly focused on, what we would call objective reality, that, they're not stepping outside of themselves in non-ordinary states of consciousness or seeking out, things like this for personal growth. I guess I don't know what my question is in there, but
let me take a shot at it here.
Please.
Objective reality. That is a total misconstrual of how it is that humans know the world. We don't know objective reality. We can't perceive the fundamental principles of how the physical universe functions. We don't have a capacity to process all kinds of information. And if you look at how the brain handles information, what we are quickly led to is that we don't actually deal with information from the world. I mean, our basic sensations are bundled into perceptions and linked to memories and affect before we ever have consciousness of the physical world. I mean, I would say apart from perhaps some very highly trained meditative adepts, we don't have any real connection with objective reality. And what we really live within is a model that we have created, by virtue of us being cultural beings who are socialized into certain linguistic systems and certain conceptual frameworks that produce for us a model of what's out there. But, the neurological science is very clear on this. We deal with models of the world, not with objective reality. And I think that this ties in with some of the other questions you had presented to me, in advance. What is it that is keeping us from understanding this notion of, the fundamental sources of reality, the nature of consciousness? It's a philosophical naivety. We don't really understand the nature of human knowledge. People go around with the notion there's an objective reality out there, and there's not. Well, all we do is we live in these little culturally constructed bubbles that to varying degrees overlap with other people's culturally constructed frameworks, and we call that objective reality. Better, it should be called, an intersubjective consensus. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean it's reality. I like to use the example of the rainbow. You and I can stand in the same place and say, yep, there is a rainbow over there, and we can talk about where it is. But the simple fact is that there is not a rainbow out there where we objectively see a rainbow. It's not there. It has to do with complex interactions between water molecules in the air and the angle of incidence of the sunlight and the properties of our eyes and how it processes information. But there's no rainbow out there. So there's no objective reality. And to me, this is one of the big, sort of impediments to a better understanding of consciousness, because people are trying to, determine what's really out there. And we're forgetting that all we're seeing is the map. We're never in the territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's almost, I've heard it described before that the outer reality is sort of a reflection of these inner schemas, these inner constructs of self. Can you still hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, that the outer reality is simply a reflection of our inner reality. And, things like if you want to change your outer reality, you first need to go inward and change the inner constructs. And so, if all our perception of reality is just these stories, these constructs that we've socially formulated in our minds, collectively and individually, to me that just screams that there's potential for us to go in there and change those models. So if right now my current model says that I cannot interact with the quantum level and put my hand through this wall next to me, then if I can somehow go inside and change the schema in my mind to the point where I believe it, then I could have the potential to interact with reality in a totally novel and different way. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, partially in the sense that we have to try to change our conceptual structures
Mm-hmm.
in order to better understand the nature of what's really out there, the operational environment. Charles Laughlin has used these terms, the operational environment and the constructed environment. The operational environment is what's really out there, but we're never going to know what that is. All we're really going to know are these constructed environments, these models we make of the world. And some of them are better for some things, and some models are better for other things. And some models can be refined, but we can't forget that they're models. Can we get away from the models? Well, that's what the meditative traditions claim can be done. They claim that we can learn to deconstruct the habits of the mind in order to obtain an unmediated perception of ultimate reality. But what is it that you perceive then? Void, nothingness. You get rid of all your constructs, there's nothing there, and everything is there.
Mm-hmm.
So these models of the world are sort of tricky little things. We can't completely get away from them if we want to engage in science and understand human psychology and understand our developmental trajectories. But at the same time, they're not the complete picture, and they're always a model rather than reality itself.
Sure. I think, the theories about manifestation and our ability to literally change circumstances and physical matter and everything in our life through intention and action, I think plays into this quite significantly in that, you're talking about these traditions, like what came to my mind right away was Buddhism. It says, go into your meditative space and deconstruct these models until you find that nothingness, and you'll find comfort in that. But I believe in our, with our Western psychotherapeutic traditions, we could deconstruct some of those stories and then reconstruct new stories that will facilitate, better functioning in everyday life. So there's not only the deconstruction, but a remodeling or remolding of a new understanding of how you meet this reality. And I personally believe that, yeah, we need to change this consensus reality for sure, but I believe that the individual's ability to change their understanding of reality, regardless of what the majority thinks, is it's a rarity, but it's something that is there and something we can utilize.
Yeah, well, I mean, we can't change reality, but we can change how we perceive it,
Mm-hmm.
and we can change how we respond to it. We can change how we act upon it. There's a lot of ways in which, it's really our own, frameworks, our own baggage that, our system of perceptions.
Mm-hmm.
And to the extent that we shift those, which is what, Buddhism talks about, you obtain nirvana, you obtain, happiness, you obtain all these things that we always want by, giving up on the desire to have those things or your notions of what they are. So, I mean, a lot of things that human beings do, bring us into misery. And it's, in part our expectations that lead us to have some sense of fault. And if we change those expectations, we can fundamentally change our experience of the world.
Yeah. And that really is that manifestation piece, that you can manifest happiness and joy, and regardless of your situation, you can manifest it, with the power of your consciousness and taking a look at those models and reconstructing them. It's kind of like putting, some real science behind, cognitive restructuring and things like that. Some real science behind this idea of, manifesting your dreams. Yeah. Oh, I hear the thunder in the background. Nice.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we don't lose our signal here.
Mm-hmm.
But, you told me you wanted to, see how it is that, we can sort of develop these better understandings of consciousness. And I'm going to put another term on you, is this notion of neurophenomenology.
Mm-hmm.
How does what we know about the neurological functioning of the brain explain what it is that we experience? And to me, this brings in some, very important perspectives that can give us a greater sense of autonomy and control over our experience and consciousness. The idea here is that when the brain functions differently, our experience of the world is different. We also know conversely, when we change our experience of the world, our brain functions differently. You go around with a smile on your face, even if you're not happy, and you start to change the way your brain's firing. The brain responds to the muscles respond to our intentions. So there's a two-way street here in which we try to understand the linkages between the phenomenal experience and the neurology. Today we're getting into, whole new realms of exploration in this regard. For instance, being able to take advanced meditators into, functional magnetic resonance machines, other kinds of brain scanning equipment. I expect, in the next, within the decade, we're going to see people doing extensive kinds of studies in that respect with psychedelics. I mean, there already are studies that are doing that have sort of fundamentally changed, for instance, our understanding of how psychedelics affect the brain.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, this is a good, model for sort of pushing the neural phenomenological point of view. How do you view the world when you've just drunk 4 cups of coffee?
Mm-hmm.
How do you view the world, if you've been, doing crack cocaine all night?
Mm-hmm.
How do you view the world when you're on psychedelics? I mean, each of these examples are examples of how neurological functions change our experience. And so I think one of the tools to understanding consciousness is going to be more and more understanding how it is that our malleable neurotransmitter systems can be sort of harnessed or dampened to produce different kinds of experience. I mean, sometimes people do this exogenously. They take a psilocybin mushroom. Meditators do it by focusing upon specific kinds of mental activities. And, other people can do it, for instance, by just understanding how their brain operates. I developed a technique years ago for falling asleep. And it basically had to do with just focusing all my attention on the basal brain where the sleep centers are located. And I found normally I could just, conk out in with 1 to 2 minutes, sometimes less, because I just put my attention in the part of the brain that produces a certain form of experience, sleep.
Sure. Yeah, and I've developed training tools for my own mind to get me into flow states more quickly and more readily during athletic events. Certain routines or mantras or almost like superstitious rituals that you do that just kind of put you right where you've trained your mind to go. So you're pretty well published on psychedelics, and that's something that I'm studying right now for my dissertation. I haven't started my dissertation, but I just started my PhD at Colorado State University, and I'll be exploring the mystical state through ketamine-assisted psychotherapies. And so altered states or non-ordinary states of consciousness is something that I'm fascinated by, something that we talk a lot about on this podcast. And something that came up from this paper that you sent me, I'm going to quote you, and then I have a question to go off the quote. So the quote says, "Altered states of consciousness are important for epistemological development since they provide experiences and evidence inconsistent with the assumptions of traditional epistemologies, expanding the phenomenological experience to be considered." Pretty much saying, that these altered states kind of challenge these models that we have in our mind based off of our own culture and our own upbringing and our own individual sort of constructs, that these psychedelics shatter that. So my question for you is, can you maybe explain how altered states, as opposed to like an ordinary state of consciousness or a non-altered state, how can altered states help us to understand the process of our construction of reality beyond, as it shows us evidence contrary to our primary consciousness?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that, a lot of times what psychologists are trying to explain on one hand is, how the human, brain mind system operates. But then the only thing they want to look at is things that have to do with rational consciousness and language.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're only looking at a narrow sliver of the capacities for experience of human beings. So to me, the first and perhaps the most important thing that these altered states and the psychedelic states give us is just more data.
Mm-hmm.
You can't start to act like you're explaining how human beings function if you haven't looked at most of these extraordinary aspects of human experience of the world. So, the psychedelics and altered states of consciousness are, first, I think, important for just opening up a broader database to be explained. And then I think, secondly, is giving us tools for exploring these experiences and understanding how it is that we come to engage with them.
Mm-hmm.
Where do these things come from? I mean, people that, take ayahuasca say, I think I've seen things that I never imagined. In fact, they say, I can hardly even tell you what it was that I saw. Well, I mean, where does this content come from? How is it that we come to, receive these kinds of visionary aspects of knowledge? And to me, this is, part brain science. I think ultimately brain science may lead us down a path that's going to give us a better sense of where these kinds of experiences come from. I proposed in a recent article that sort of takes an evolutionary psychology perspective is that this is probably part of the mimetic brain. This is probably part of our mirror neuron system, that there are some basic ways in which the human brain processes information that's simultaneously behavior and visual and emotive, all linked together. And in this sense, I think we're ultimately going to need totally different paradigms that have to do with the way in which people are going to experience the world through the frameworks that are pre-language.
Mm-hmm.
And that starts to become the challenge. How do we then bring information back from these visual capacities, what I would call, using other people's term, a presentational system. The information is presented to you rather than represented to you. And how do we go from these visual experiences back to something that can be shared intersubjectively and subjected to some kind of, scientific development?
Sure. So, yeah, and I've heard that talked about a lot as far as theories of what psychedelics are doing, like opening up our ability to perceive more in our environment that's always there all the time, but our bandwidth or our filters are up during during ordinary consciousness. And so these psychedelics kind of open those channels up and allow us to see more of what's really there. But also another good point too is, how do we bring that back, what has been shown to us that is already there, and turn it into something that we can share with other people where they don't think that we're crazy, for seeing something that they would be able to perceive too, if they were able to maybe match that frequency or that wavelength within the larger system.
Yeah, I think that the model that's emerging about psychedelic effects is one that's been around a while, which is the prefrontal cortex, our top-down control of information, is compromised. And then secondly, the default mode network that sort of links our our personal history and our emotions and our sort of thinking about the past and the future is sort of disrupted, and the brain circuitry that normally maintains our internal dialogue, our sort of talking to ourselves about who we are and what we're doing, gets cut off. And then what's happening is that these deep aspects of human cognitive processing, innate modular structures related to the ancient levels of the brain, are being freed to express themselves. And it's not, just the fact that the suppression's removed, it's that they're now being empowered in a way that carries their information to the frontal cortex. And so now we're getting information that's, as I think you suggested, less filtered. It's more part of the innate representational systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, in some of my past ayahuasca experiences, I have, been shown been shown images of, animals from the jungle, serpents and jaguars and things like that, that I've never been to the Amazon myself, and I've also had experiences where I've lived parts of, as a cell inside of a plant, the different life systems of a plant, under the influence of some of these medicines from the Amazon. And those are, common experiences across people who take this particular medicine. So the idea that, some of these gateways or these molecules can open us to information that is always there, maybe, or maybe contained within the plant, is something that is really interesting. But also, with different psychedelic medicines, people will experience similar things, such as like with DMT, people will see the same DMT entities across trip reports, or like with ayahuasca, certain animal archetypes, people seeing past life experiences that can maybe later be confirmed, or histories that they've never lived, that they're opened up to. And being that the person's individual biology doesn't necessarily have a history with Amazonian animals or archetypes or these past lives, what do you think might be going on there as far as, what are we tuning into when we tune into these things?
Well, I mean, the first thing I want to say is that, we shouldn't be naive. I mean, there's hardly anybody that's drunk ayahuasca that hasn't heard about, anaconda and jaguar motifs. I mean, so whether or not we come from Amazonia, we still have a kind of system of consciousness about these substances. But on the other hand, I'll go back to what I was saying previously about these innate modules. I mean, one of them turns out to be animal species recognition. And without elaborating on it, I would just say that we have an innate capacity to recognize animal species. And I suspect that the animal species that sort of are most salient are the ones that have had the greatest implications for, human predation, which is to say, anacondas and jaguars. I mean, they've probably collectively, they've eaten more than any, most other animals of human beings. You throw in the wolves there, which is another, common motif in shamanism. I mean, they're animals that, clearly pose risk, and we're sort of hair triggered to find those kinds of entities. But the other thing I would go on to is to say that, I mean, consciousness is this knowing with. It's between a knower and something known, but there's going to be some vibrational energy there. Whether it's light or sound, it's a vibration.
And that's a physical energy that can be measured potentially.
No, I don't know how easily it will be to measure, but the simple fact is that, if you see something or hear something, it's a vibrational quality. I mean, smell, we can talk about pheromones and other things, but it's a vibrational quality. And vibrations transmit in all directions, not just their, vector. And so information that is part of one person's consciousness, it has a reverberatory quality in the universe. And for instance, if you're interested in issues of, parapsychology and concepts of such as hauntings, there's this notion that people's emotional energies somehow become impregnated in the physical environment, and that other people can come there and pick up on those same vibrational energies. So to me, this can also be another way of understanding how it is that we can have consciousness of things that aren't part of our own personal history or biology. Somebody else had that. It created a vibrational, sort of standing wave, and that standing wave is in some sense still accessible, even though it may have propagated to other places. So to me, your earlier questions about, some collective consciousness, to me might come down to more like some notion that everything that has ever been experienced is still part of the vibrational fabric of the universe. And
Right.
people who can put themselves into the right receptive state can access those vibrational energies.
Almost like it's like a field rather than, maybe when you, excuse me, when some people think of an individual consciousness next to collective consciousness, it's more like a beam as opposed to like this field where everything is contained. And I really like that idea, because the idea of the Akashic records and just this infinite amount of human experience and information that's still out there vibrating, that we have the potential, like you said, like some of these lost skills in consciousness where I might be able to tune my personal consciousness into the resonance of Albert Einstein, floating somewhere out here in this field. I think that's fascinating, being able to do that. What do you think about the idea of other brains' influence? So, we have our brain up here, but we also know that we have our gut brain and the microbiome down there, and that there's a lot more neurons in our gut than there even are in our brain, and intuition and all these things. What do you think maybe our gut brain's influence on consciousness is, if there is any at all?
Well, I mean, there's lots of different influences. I mean, beginning with, that's where most of our neurotransmitters are being produced. There's more neurotransmitters in your gut than in your brain. I think the other perspective I would want to put out here is that, we have a variety of energy fields that can be measured with, standard electrical sensors that extend, I think, up to 12 to 15 feet from our bodies. Mm-hmm. And our bodies can also perceive those energy fields of other people. I'm sure there's been at times where, you've been around someone that just makes you feel really uncomfortable for some reason you don't know. I mean, this is the physical energy more likely. I mean, we have things about, gut instincts, and those kinds of notions of intuition. I mean, those are part of these complex physiological systems that aren't necessarily well understood by modern science, but I think traditionally have been sort of used as a field device to perceive other energies.
It's a way of knowing, like you said, like that's what consciousness is. It's a way of knowing what is to be known.
And of course, then the question is, how do we get that gut instinct up to something that's cognitive enough to be able to share with others? Or do we just go on what the gut instinct says and do whatever it drives us to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
But let me just sort of address some of the questions that you sort of laid out for me here, since we're kind of coming up on an hour here. You ask about, modern shamanism. How do we use modern shamanism to allow us to move away from Western medicine? And I think, the first thing is that there may be, and I don't know all of it, there may be things that Western medicine really is the only answer for. We shouldn't expect that shamanism is going to, replace Western medicine, unless you want to include the entire pharmacopoeia of plant medicines that exist on the planet. We often think of shamans as being, spiritual healers, but in fact, in pre-modern societies, shamans knew plants and they used them. So, that may be one way that we can sort of expand our understanding of what shamanism is. But the other thing I would say, if we want to be able to expand shamanism application to address modern health, maladies, I think we have to understand shamanism in a biopsychosocial perspective. And that's why when I did volume 2 or edition 2 of shamanism, I changed the subtitle, because I thought we really need to understand these linkages among biology, our personal sense of being, and our social relations. And it's a two-way street. Taking the right drugs can change how we feel and change how we relate to people. Changing how we relate to people can change how we feel about ourselves, can stimulate different kinds of productions of neurotransmitters. So it's these, complex linkages across levels of the hierarchy of being that I think have to be understood to apply shamanism, and to be able to do things like apply ritual to modulate the stress response, to change the balance in the autonomic nervous system, to change the habitual reactive patterns of our vagal system, to tune and tone and refine a whole variety of physiological responses, understanding how it is that altered states of consciousness and ritual can enhance our ability to use our intention to modify these linkages among the biological, psychological, and social levels of human well-being.
Mm-hmm. And I've been bringing this question up quite a bit recently on the podcast, and I'd love to hear your point of view. I studied shamanism a lot in college as well, and I'm finding that along with this new psychedelic renaissance or renaissance in forward consciousness thinking, there seems to be quite a bit of appropriation happening from the United States as far as appropriating shamanistic cultures and rituals from other traditions without examining like what our own culture is around altered states and psychedelics here in the US. And I think I think it's essential that we as the West define for ourselves, what does consciousness mean for us? How are we gonna bring this into the culture in a way that is meaningful for us, where we're not just stealing from the Amazonians and stealing from the shamans of Siberia and stealing from these other people, although we have a lot that we can learn from those traditions. I agree, like around ritual and intention and priming the mind and integration and things like that, but we're not those other cultures. We're the West. We come from a background recently where we are so tied in with Western medicine and the idea that a doctor is going to fix me, and we've gotten away from our initial ideas of self-healing. Like, we have to create something new for ourselves, a new culture around, what does consciousness and altered states mean to us? And so, being that you have, read extensively into shamanism and you've seen how it has interacted with our culture thus far, what do you think is the best course moving forward? Would it behoove us to identify our own culture around this, or is it okay for us to use these traditions that have been around for many thousands of years outside of this context?
Well, a lot of questions there and a lot of levels to try to address. I guess the first thing I would say is that, the Western cultures, Indo-European cultures for the most part, systematically destroyed shamanism and its vestiges. We lost whatever was part of that cultural heritage for the most part, and we only know that we had shamanism in the past through indirect kinds of information. Secondly, I would say that, some of the information that it can inform us about the past are these neurobiological models of shamanism, which is to say an understanding of how shamanism relates to human evolution, human cognition, human, emotional modulation, human social modulation, basically the kind of biological models that I have developed and presented in my book on shamanism. So what that then tells us is, this is what shamanism is like generically, inherently, biologically, intrinsically. And if we reconstruct that past using other ethnographic cases, other cultures as sort of models to enrich that, we're really only after what it is that we had in the past. We're reconstructing. When you come to the issue about, outright cultural appropriation, there's some tricky territory here. But I think that within the context of shamanistic traditions, you have to have permission to use people's rituals. You pay for people's, spells sometimes. You pay to use certain chants. You acquire a right that's personal, not necessarily cultural. If you've acquired that right, then from my way of thinking, you are then entitled to use that as was part of your understanding with the person that passed that on to you, which may include that you can sell it or give it, or maybe that you can just use it. Mm-hmm. But today we're in a situation in which, we've lost the entheogenic paradigms of the Western world. We may rediscover aspects of them, but, the traditions are gone. The shamanic traditions, were eliminated 500, 1,000 years or more ago. So we have to kind of reconstruct and recreate. And I think the predominant model of shamanic learning in the past was that you learn from the spirits. So if your shamanic work leads you to relate to the spirit world in a way that invests you with certain kinds of knowledge, be it ritual, be it songs, be it healing, then in the traditional shamanic worldview, this is yours to use. You may have to pay for it in some way. You may have to, show certain respect. You may have to, engage in certain rituals to, pay those who gave you the information and the abilities, but it's yours to use. And to me, cultural appropriation is more when you take something that's, completely from one culture and now you try to commercialize it on your own. I mean, to me, that's, an aspect of appropriation that probably doesn't even work well. It's not, true to what shamanism was, which is to say biopsychosocial adaptation that took what is sort of inherent to the human condition, but then adapted it to the social circumstances and the individual psychology of the people involved.
Wow. So much that we've covered today, and we've barely only scratched the surface of most of these issues. I want to say thank you again for your time. And if people want to reach out to you, if they have more questions, or if you have a website, would you mind putting that out there for the listeners to find?
Sure. I mean, if you just Google my name, Michael Winkelman, my website will come up as one of the top ones. I'm not the child actor who's dead. My website's michaelwinkelman.com. I've got a bunch of my information there about some of the major books I've published. If people want to, and you can get in touch with me via email off of my website. If people want to read the academic stuff I published, whether it's about shamanism or psychedelics or use of psychedelics in addictions treatment or conscious, whatever, all those things, almost all of my articles are available on researchgate.net. So go to ResearchGate, Google me. There's probably 130 articles there that cover in much greater depth than what we could do today some of the ideas I've developed over the last 40 years.
That's great. And I just want to let you know before we get off the recording, here in Colorado, we just formed our first ever Denver psilocybin mushroom policy review panel. And I was selected as one of those 11 members to help inform the mayor about all sorts of things, from education to training the law enforcement to collecting data on decriminalization, things like that. And they chose me because of my my background as a licensed addiction counselor. So I think, in the future, if you'd like to come back on the show, I'd love to pick your brain about using these kind of medicines for substance abuse and substance dependence issues. I think that's a huge thing that's going to be a big help for all of us, being a former addict myself also. Last thing, I just wanted to ask you, are you going to be at the Consciousness Conference in Arizona in April?
No, I don't know if I made it clear, but I'm in Brazil now, and I don't make it back to the U.S. very often.
Yeah, I had no idea. That's great.
But yeah, I'll be glad to come talk with you sometime about using the psychedelics for dealing with addictions. I've got 3 or 4 articles published on that, and just this past year, Ben Sessa and I edited a book called Advances in Psychedelic Medicine, and several of the articles in there address the application of psychedelics for either ameliorating or treating addictions problems. So there's a growing paradigm out there, and I think that it's a very important one, and I think ultimately we're not going to beat the scourge of addiction until we have effective psychedelic treatment programs for addicts.
Yeah, and some would even say that a lot of our mental disorders are addictions also, depression, people get addicted to certain thought patterns, anger, get addicted to certain emotions. So yeah, I think it's paradigm shifting. Well, I want to thank you for coming on the show again. Thank you for your time. And I guess that's it. We'll call it a day.
Good luck moving forward. Thanks for talking to me.
Thank you. Conversations with the Mind podcast is sponsored by mindops.com. You can find us at www.mind-ops.com. We're an eclectic counseling company providing mental health and mental performance services to individuals, small and large groups, teams, businesses, military, through face-to-face sessions or at a distance using phone or confidential video chat apps. We bring a unique Buddhist Western lens and specialize in general psychotherapy for all mental difficulties, sport and performance psychology for performance enhancement, addiction counseling for any maladaptive or destructive habits, and psychedelic integration therapy to make the most from your visionary medicine work. We are available as well for corporate workshops to address the needs of your employees' wellness.